Are we good? Are we ready?
Yeah.
All right. So there are a lot of people in the world who like to argue that history isn't important. It's not the most important subject in school. It's not the most important subject that you can know. But really, this isn't true. For example, in the 1950s, there were racial riots all throughout America in order to gain rights for African Americans. This is a picture from one of those riots. And this is a picture from the 2015 Baltimore riots. See any similarities? Also, some people say that Gettysburg isn't that important because it was only a span of 3 days in a 4-year war that was fought in a country that's only 300 years old. How can this really affect our history? It's really a good question. History is math. History is science. History is music. It's videos. It's dancing. It's every way that you can express yourself. If it's not happening right now, it's history. So Gettysburg. Has anyone here ever been to Gettysburg? Oh good, that's a decent amount, good. Gettysburg took place over a span of 3 days. It started on July 3rd, 1863, and continued started on July 1st, 1863, and continued to July 3rd, 1863. At Gettysburg, there is something called the Cyclorama. It is a 42-foot tall, 377-foot long mural of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's 360 degrees, and it was finished in 1877. It is depicting the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg. When you see the mural, it is lit from behind, and there's a speaker that talks to you about all of the battles. So, Gettysburg was a crossroads. The Confederate Army was traveling towards Gettysburg, or towards Harrisburg, in order to capture Harrisburg, which had become the new capital of the United States. So on July 1st, 1863, it was gray and it was overcast. It was almost like a predictor of what was to come. It was hot, it was humid, it was 80 degrees at least, if not more, and they were wearing wool uniforms, which made it really, really uncomfortable. Both armies were equally armed. The Union were standing on a hill, looking over a forest, and then the Confederates came out of that forest and attacked the Union. It went from nothing to monumentous in a matter of seconds. It was deafening. One general commented that so many color guards were killed during the battle that no man could take the colors and live. On the 2nd day of Gettysburg, it was also hot and humid. I mean, this was July, and it is in the middle of a field, so the sun was beating down. It was hot, it was kind of gross. So General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was told to keep the high ground, which was Little Round Top, at all costs, no matter what he had to do. He volleyed, and then he had no ammo. He told his men to arm themselves with bayonets. They charged down the hill and kept the high ground. On the 3rd day of Gettysburg, the soldiers lined up in a long line. The Confederates stood there. It was rather like the Revolution. The Revolution, when weapons weren't as accurate and you had to stand that close because you couldn't shoot anyone. But the weapons were different now, and it was a slaughter. So, I mean, really, 3 days. 3 days. How can that really change our nation's history? How can that affect us today? It's a good question. It's a valid question, and I totally understand it. Why does it matter? 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who have fought struggles here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is far beyond us. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion for that cause which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. Does anyone not know what that was? That was the Gettysburg Address said by Abraham Lincoln. It truly did immortalize people. Anyone can tell you where those first 6 words came from. 70 years. They're from the Gettysburg Address, read by Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Cemetery. Lincoln himself was tall, gangly, unkempt, and his face was constantly moving. He was actually a really happy person, but what we see here is his very stern face. It was his camera face, as his wife called it, which I feel like there's still kind of a camera face today. During the reading of the speech, people weren't really all that impressed. I mean, it was only 2 minutes, and by the time they were actually paying attention and listening, the speech was over. It's kind of something that you can only enjoy if you read it carefully and analyze it, if you go all AP English on it. It was preceded by a speaker named Everett, who spoke for 2 hours. Everett said, "I should be glad that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." The Gettysburg Address was read at the dedication of the Gettysburg Cemetery. It was a final resting place for those who had died in the fight. You can still visit it. You can even stand where Abraham Lincoln stood. It's one of the most recognizable speeches in history, and so many people have referenced it, including Barack Obama. Now, slavery. I understand that I can't talk about the Civil War without talking about slavery. It's a crucial part, and it is why most people believe the war was fought. But I'm not going to talk about it as much as I should, or as much as most people would expect, because if I talk about slavery, you pick sides. And I don't want you to pick sides. I want you to believe that they were truly fighting on equal grounds, like the way they believed it 150 years ago. One quote that I read was, "For if you have chosen to throw your lot in with this country, the American Civil War is at the foundation of your reasons to do so." War is an important part of where you live, and I guess that just never really occurred to me. War can define all sorts of things, including racial tensions. The Civil War shaped racial struggles and changed it to what it is today. It decided the fate of the war, and therefore decided the fate of our nation. After Gettysburg was fought, many African Americans decided to join the war and fight for the cause. However, there were some colored units, and they offered to fight at Gettysburg, but the people at Gettysburg said no. Like, the North said no, which is just kind of ironic. It's kind of wonder what they were thinking. After Gettysburg, about 2 weeks after Gettysburg, an African-American company protected Harrisburg and kept the Confederate Army from taking Harrisburg. Gettysburg was also home to hundreds of free black slaves. They ran from fear of the fight, or they didn't run from fear of the fight. Rather, they ran from fear of being returned to their former slavery. Thanks to the Fugitive Slave Act, people could come into the North, take back slaves to the South, even if they were free and even if they were born in the North. Some people suggest that the Emancipation Proclamation, as put by Abraham Lincoln, wasn't actually to free slaves, but more as a power move over the South, a way to say, I'm still in control of you, whether you like it or not. The leaders in the Civil War were incredible people. you never quite realize how powerful they were until you think about kind of the battles that they led the soldiers into and just the absolute hell that they entered with these men who didn't have to be there. The leaders were kind and they were knowledgeable. Compared the revolution, the American Revolution had been fought before this, and the old ways of fighting were still kind of intact, but because of the accuracy of the weapons, new ways had to be developed. This is General Joshua Chamberlain, and he was given 120 men who were told that they were going to be court-martialed or they could join the army, or they could rejoin the army. So he gave them a speech. He was previously an English teacher, so he could speak well, speak fluently, and he convinced, I believe it was 117 out of the 120 to rejoin, and they became some of his best fighters. People trusted him so much that one man was shot in the face, wrapped a bandage around it, and came back and continued to fight. One Confederate soldier sent Joshua Chamberlain a letter, and he said, during the Battle of Little Round Top, I had a perfect shot at you. I could have killed you instantly. The bullet, like, there was no chance you would have survived, but I couldn't do it because of the aura that you gave off as a leader. One soldier had been demoted before the Battle of Gettysburg. He'd been demoted and he was lying on the field and he had been shot and he was dying. And Chamberlain came up to him and the man said, "Tell my mother I did not die a coward." And Chamberlain was so touched by this and he knew the man was such a good person that he said, "You die a sergeant. I promote you for faithful service and noble courage on the field of Gettysburg." The leaders of the Civil War were well respected. People disappeared from history. People only remember the glamorous stories, all of the stories of heroism. There are so many people who are in history who we just forgot completely about, and it's almost scary how many people we just don't know about anymore. This is General Longstreet, and he was one of Lee's right-hand men, but really no one knows that much about him because General Robert E. Lee was the bigger figurehead. Robert E. Lee himself, he was a genius, just a complete genius. He revolutionized fighting. He pulled tactics directly from Napoleon, and this roundabout way of fighting and the organized army men almost won him the war. So don't be fooled, don't think that the North was winning at all. It really did turn during Gettysburg when he made one fatal mistake. He was asked to be the president of the Confederate States of America, but he declined because he wanted to spend time with his family. Now, I don't know about you, but I never really personally considered Robert E. Lee to be a person. He's a husband, he's a father. He sent his daughter a letter, and he calls her "my precious life." And I think that kind of shows the human aspect of Robert E. Lee and the way that we judge him based on the actions of a nation rather than based on his own personal behaviors. In this letter, he told his daughter to, say hi to your mother for me, here are all the things that I've done, make sure that your brother isn't too bad. It was the usual fatherly talk that you would expect from anyone. You just don't realize that these people that we immortalize in stone are human. They can be either the last hope or the worst enemy, but they are human. Okay. Weapons improved greatly during the Civil War. Weapons were a huge part of the Civil War, and it's what made it such a bad fight. Some looked antique, but the accuracy grew from helter-skelter to deadly in just a matter of years. Old practices still reigned during the Civil War, meaning that at the beginning of the Civil War, soldiers would line up and march towards each other. This worked really well during the Revolution when the guns didn't shoot straight and even if you were this close to someone, you wouldn't hit them. However, with accuracy improving, marching up to someone in a straight line was basically walking to your death. The weapons that most soldiers typically used was a smoothbore musket. Now this musket was grooved on the inside in a spinning motion. When you drop the ball in and then shoot it out, the ball spun, and this increased accuracy and improved the distance by about 1,000 yards. Also, there was a new way to fire. This held your gunpowder and it kept it dry, so even during rain you could shoot farther, faster, and longer. Okay. Musket balls were used during this time. A musket ball weighs about 500 grams. One general sent a bunch of his troops out onto the field to collect musket balls because they're reusable. Either you can remelt them down and create more musket balls, or you can just reuse them completely in the gun. From one battlefield, he collected over 2.5 tons of musket balls. Just to give you some perspective, that's about, a ton is about 900 grams, or sorry, 900,000 grams. And so that would be about 1.8 million musket balls per ton. Cannons shot exploding shells up to 1.5 miles away. This was deadly, it was devastating during the Civil War. Canister guns shot several hundred balls at once. 2 cannons could take down an entire front line with just one shot. Cannons are so deadly that the population of Orland, Pennsylvania would be taken down in a matter of minutes. The sound of the war was deafening, and gunners' ears bled just from the sounds of guns going off so close to them. The ground shook, fences jumped. Hand-to-hand combat was not popular during the Civil War. It wasn't as used as it was in some other wars, but when it was used, it was deadly. Soldiers used bayonets, and these were like swords that they attached to their guns, and hand-to-hand combat was just completely lethal when it was used, though rarely. Another thing that you should know about a musket ball is that it doesn't enter and exit like a modern bullet does. If you shoot someone with a musket ball, it's going to stay there. And that is why medicine was such a mess. Medical knowledge was not prepared for the wounds and the medical requirements of the Civil War. Most people rethought their ideas on health after the Civil War, and it changed medicine dramatically. Now, I know when you think of the Civil War medicine, you think blood and pain and screaming and hacked off limbs, and it would be a lie if I said that this wasn't true during some parts of it. There's a general feeling of disgust towards Civil War medicine, which is understandable. However, you need to realize that not only were wounds one of the reasons that people died, but illnesses were too. Some historians believe that more people died from illnesses than died from actual wounds themselves. Some soldiers had dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, mumps, measles, tuberculosis. Hospitals during the Civil War were not fit to run. Division hospitals were tents set up in the middle of the battlefield. They were surrounded by poor sanitation, and the thought of germs hadn't even been created yet, so a cleanly hospital was virtually unheard of. Some new medical practices that stemmed from the Civil War were bloodletting, which was intentionally bleeding a patient, purging, which was inducing vomiting, and blistering, which was heating up a glass, putting it on top of the skin, and rising up the skin in order to remove blood. Doctors learned new things. They treated syphilis with mercury, which was kind of fighting one evil with another evil. They cut off limbs even though they didn't know what was wrong, but amputation was a life-saving procedure. And when doctors had it, they used chloroform to knock patients out when they needed it. The Civil War brought about better medication, and it even brought about organized relief agencies. This is Clara Barton, who started the American Red Cross. To this day, it's still running, and it's still going strong, and it has saved millions of lives. So during this presentation, Josh talked about how we as a culture are desensitized to the idea of war. Believe it or not, during the Civil War, the people were too. Though they didn't have TV shows or video games or anything like that. But they had stories. They had stories about the swashbuckling rogue who saves the lady and dies heroically at the end. But that wasn't the case. The first man who died in the Civil War was glorified. He was wrapped in a flag and marched through Washington, D.C. People called him a martyr because he was the first to die for his cause. However, he was the first and the last to be so celebrated. Thousands died and thousands went missing. They were put into unmarked mass graves, which means that their bodies weren't even returned home. One man was only recognized by the color of his beard because his face resembled that of a blood-soaked sponge. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the bloodiest battles in the United States history. It's ranked number 4. Now, imagine, everyone in this room has 1,000 male relatives and friends. Seems like a lot. You're a very popular person. Now, if every one of them died, that wouldn't even equal half of the amount of people who died at Gettysburg. And it would only be 1/3 of the amount of people who died during the Civil War. 2,750,000 soldiers fought during the Civil War. 27% of them died. That means 750,000 people died. All of the other wars combined, the people who died equals only about a few percent higher than the amount of people who died during the Civil War, meaning that of every other war combined, the Civil War has almost as many deaths. In Gettysburg, 51,000 were dead over the span of 3 days. That's the population of Springfield Township High School being killed 85 times over. People sent their brothers, their husbands, their uncles, their cousins, all of their loved ones, and some never returned. Loved ones were told that their relatives were ready to die, and friends were ready to die. Thousands died abruptly and unexpectedly, and some bodies weren't even returned. Thousands fell into trenches and just never came back out. Though some thought that they would return heroes, the people that did return were battle-torn and had mental problems that just couldn't be fixed. After the war, soldiers respected each other because they knew what the other person had to go through. So, I guess one of the questions is, are there still bodies at Gettysburg? And the answer is yes. We must honor these dead rightfully. Glorious monuments like this one are not all we can do to remember the dead. Let me tell you a story. I went to visit Gettysburg with my dad when I was 12 or 13. And when we went to visit, we were going to go on this horseback riding tour. I was still in my crazy horse girl phase. So I was so excited for this, and you know, Gettysburg history, horses. I mean, obvious choice there. So we went through the whole trip, nothing really clicked, and then we went into this field. My dad pulled over, and I was like, oh boy, I've always wanted to run through a field. So I get out of the car, and I run, 70 or 80 feet, or yards, or something like that, into the center of the field, and I stop, and I stand there, and I listen. And I know that there is something off about this place. Even as a 13-year-old kid, I knew that something wasn't quite right. beautiful landscape. If you've never been to Gettysburg, I highly recommend that you go. But it's a beautiful landscape, but it hides what truly happened there. Math and English teachers died here. Brothers, husbands, uncles, cousins, they all died here, but they all still live here. On the last day of the Battle of Gettysburg, it poured rain. Now, for anyone who was paying attention in English class, rain symbolizes rebirth and sadness, and I found the poetic justice of that beautiful and kind of haunting. But I don't believe that Gettysburg is like scary haunted, you know? It's not scary haunted, it's not something that you should be afraid of. You just need to understand that there are stories on the field that haven't been told and might never be told if you don't listen. But I mean, after all, who are we to say that something doesn't exist? So now I'm sure you're asking yourself, so what? This happened 150 years ago. Really? Who cares? I can't do anything about it. It happened lifetimes before me. Well, I mean, you have a good point. I can't do anything about it either. However, let me tell you a little bit about Gettysburg. Gettysburg is hilly, it's rocky, it's not good for development. And yet, the Civil War battlefield conservation had to save land in the middle of Pickett's charge from a hotel that was going to build there. They also saved land from a country club that was going to build a 9-hole golf course on the Gettysburg battlefield. They even rebuilt the museum so it wasn't in the middle of the battlefield anymore. They're trying to keep the integrity of the battlefield. There are 1,400 monuments celebrating people who have died in Gettysburg. 1/3 of the pictures taken of dead soldiers at the Civil War were taken at Gettysburg. Now, raise your hands again if you've ever been to Gettysburg. So that's most of you, but some of you, you have history in your own backyard. It's 2 hours away. Find it and save it before it becomes this. This, 150 years ago, was a Civil War encampment. These pictures were taken by Greg Segal, who took reenactors to where they had fought and repositioned them to where they would have stood 150 years ago. Now, as you can see, they have buildings behind them. No matter the surroundings, he took the pictures. So no wonder our nation forgets about our history. We build domino pizzas on top of Civil War battlefields that we should be remembering. Homes were built where men sacrificed their lives. If we think about that, if someone did something like that now, so many people would be offended. But why is no one offended anymore? This is a buffet in Gettysburg. I mean, hey, at least there's a mural in the background to simplify that something happened there. Symbolize that something happened there. And just, there's no real respect for the dead or the people who sacrificed their lives for our countries. We talk about Memorial Day and remembering those who died, and no one remembers those who fought one of the hardest wars where they had to fight against their brothers and their families and their friends. This is a picture of a hotel that was built on top of a graveyard in Gettysburg. Let's talk about that. This is a hotel built on top of a graveyard. This is a hotel built on top of a graveyard in one of the most haunted places in America. Wasn't the brightest idea someone has ever had. Now, I have a video to show you.
By the flow of the inland river, whence the fleets of iron have fled, where the blades of the great grass quiver, asleep are the ranks of the dead. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day, under the one, the blue, under the other, the gray. These in the rovings of glory, those in the gloom of defeat, all with the battle blood gory in the dusk of eternity meet. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Under the laurel, the blue, under the willow, the gray.
At Gettysburg in 1913, thousands of veterans gathered to mark the 50th anniversary of the battle. And when old Confederates emulating Pickett's charge approached the Union line, old Yankees rose from behind the stone wall to embrace them as brothers. From the silence of sorrowful hours, the desolate mourners go, lovingly laden with flowers, alike for the friend and the foe. Under the sod and the dew, waiting the judgment day. Under the one, the blue. Under the other, the gray.
That was great.
Thank you. Yes, perfect.
Have you ever done like a Civil War reenactment before?
No, I want to. The costumes themselves are kind of expensive. I know the dresses range in like the 400 price range, but obviously you can reuse them. And the uniforms, 200 plus a gun, that's another 200 plus shoes, accessories, another 200. So it's an expensive hobby, but it's one that I hope to get into eventually. Anybody else?
They had great beards back then.
Yes.
So, I just out of curiosity's sake, did you purposefully select this date to present your project?
That was complete irony. Yesterday I was practicing my presentation and I was like, oh, it's Memorial Day. Oh, wait a minute, that would be perfect. So it just kind of happened that way. It definitely wasn't, I definitely didn't even think of that. I just thought, oh, this is a good date, not too late, not too early.
Really, very, very fitting.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is twofold. One, like what really, obviously you have an interest in history.
Yes.
But what was it specifically about researching Gettysburg that kind of prompted you? I mean, clearly you addressed many facets in your presentation, but what was the impetus to begin? Why Gettysburg? Was it something you wanted to learn more about, or was it just something you felt was so important that you just had to delve into it more?
It's definitely one of the only battles that's talked about so completely in depth, and I think that influenced me. If you talk to reenactors, they tend to think that the most important battles that were held were the ones that they reenact at, because they know it more in depth. When I went to visit Gettysburg, I haven't been ever since I kind of realized, I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. I realized that I liked Gettysburg, ironically enough, on the drive away from Gettysburg. But I wanted to research it more just because it's such an interesting story. Like, it's a story, it's not just history, there are stories behind it. There are all sorts of movies, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a movie called Gettysburg, ironically enough. And it's amazing, it's so good, it's really good, I recommend it. There's a book called The Killer Angels, which I also recommend. Read it on my free time, because I'm a nerd like that. And it's so cool. Like, I think it's so cool, and I think that it's so important that we don't forget this history, because it's literally in our own backyard. Gettysburg is like 2 hours away, and it's just, I feel like nobody really appreciates the stories or the meaning behind the battles themselves. Yes?
You talked about how like, you know, they build on battlefields and stuff. And I think it was interesting yesterday, I was watching the Winmore Memorial Day Parade, and they had Civil War reenactors walk by, which I had never seen before in our Memorial Day Parade. And I was just wondering if in your research or just in your experience, if you think, like, in more modern times, like now, especially with, you know, Gods and Generals and Gettysburg, with the making of such amazing movies, do you think we're kind of regaining back the respect that had been lost in the past 100 years?
I do think that. I know that the reenactors who were taking part in Gettysburg, the director at first wanted to make it more dramatized, like Hollywood version, as they do with anything nowadays. But the reenactors were like, listen, we won't be in this movie unless it is true to the book and it's honest and it's all this stuff. And that's definitely important. I read during my research that there is one Revolutionary War battlefield that is still intact, out of like hundreds that were